Picture a summer night in the 1890s. A freight engine grinds upgrade in the dark, its firebox glowing orange, the fireman swinging his shovel in the same rhythm he has kept for 1,000 nights. The water glass reads normal. The pressure gauge sits exactly where it always sits. Everything about this moment is ordinary. And then, in less than a heartbeat, the man is simply gone, along with the engine beneath his feet, thrown across a quarter-mile of trackside field in pieces too small to bury. Here is the unsettling part. He may have done nothing that 100 other crews had not done and lived through. That is what made these machines so frightening to the people who ran them. For most of the age of steam, the most dangerous place on the entire railroad was not the open track ahead of the train, where a stalled wagon might be waiting on a crossing. It was not even the coupling between cars, though that took its own steady toll of fingers and hands. The most dangerous place was the few square feet where the crew actually stood, their backs turned to a machine that could kill them faster than they could form the thought. So why did the locomotive, the machine that hauled the modern world into existence, so often turn on the very people closest to it? The answer comes down to a small handful of failure points, and almost every one of them sat within arm's reach of the men in the cab. Start with what a boiler really is, because most people picture it wrong. A steam locomotive is not an engine with a fire in it. It is a bomb that has been talked into behaving. Inside that long cylinder of riveted steel sits several hundred gallons of water, heated far past the temperature at which it would normally boil, and held as a liquid only by the enormous pressure crushing down on it from every side. On a working freight engine, that pressure often ran to 200 pounds on every square inch of surface. The water inside was sitting at close to 400 degrees, desperate to become steam and expand, restrained by nothing but a wall of metal and the crew's constant, careful attention. And the crew stood right against that wall. There was no distance, no shielding, no safe operating range. The engineer's elbow was inches from the backhead. The fireman worked with his body half inside the glow of the firebox door. Whatever the boiler had stored up, the two men in the cab would be the first to receive it. Which brings us to the single most important piece of steel in the whole machine, and the one that killed more crews than any other. It is called the crown sheet, and it forms the roof of the firebox, the flat plate of metal directly above the fire itself. On one side, flames burning at well over 2,000 degrees. On the other side, water. As long as water covers that plate, the water pulls the heat away as fast as the fire delivers it, and the steel stays strong. The whole survival of the machine, and everyone on it, depends on keeping that one sheet wet. Let the water level drop below it, and the physics turn merciless. With no water to carry off the heat, the exposed steel climbs past 1,200 degrees, and at that temperature, it stops behaving like a structural metal at all. It goes soft. It sags. And it is still holding back 200 pounds of pressure. In an instant, the plate tears away from the bolts anchoring it, and the moment it fails, the pressure that was holding all that superheated water in liquid form vanishes. Hundreds of gallons flash into steam at once, expanding roughly 1,600 times in volume in a fraction of a second. That expansion is the explosion. It has been known to rip the entire boiler off the locomotive frame and throw it, whole, hundreds of feet through the air, sometimes end over end, sometimes clean over the trailing cars. And the cab, with the crew inside it, is standing directly behind the blast. Superheated steam finds them first. At a temperature that cooks flesh through clothing, before a person can even register pain. Investigators picking through the wreckage afterward often found the frame stripped bare, the wheels still on the rails, and the great steel boiler resting in a field somewhere down the line, as if a giant had plucked it off and tossed it aside. What they almost never found intact were the men. A crown sheet failure gave no warning a person could act on, no rising whine, no shutter, no window of a few seconds to jump. One moment the cab existed, and the next, it did not. This was not a rare freak event. In a single year late in the 19th century, the United States recorded well over 100 boiler explosions of all kinds, and across one 10-year stretch, the number ran into the thousands. Not all were locomotives, but a great many were, and firebox failures from uncovered crown sheets accounted for the majority of them. For decades, boiler explosions were simply a background fact of industrial life, like mine collapses or factory fires. The men who climbed into the cab knew the odds. They climbed in anyway. But if keeping the water above the crown sheet was so obviously vital, how did experienced crews ever let it drop? Sometimes the answer was human error, a moment of distraction on a hard grade. More often, the machine itself was lying to them. The crew judged the water level through a slender glass tube mounted on the backhead, the water glass, and through a set of small valves called tricocks. These were the only windows into a sealed pressure vessel they could never see inside. But water glasses clogged. Mineral scale from hard water built up inside the fittings until the level shown in the glass no longer matched the level in the boiler. A gauge could sit there reading a comfortable, reassuring depth of water, while the real level had already sunk toward the danger line. And the pumps and injectors that were supposed to push fresh water in could fail quietly, so that a crew believed they were feeding the boiler when nothing was actually going in. Investigators would later find engines that had run miles with no water showing in the glass, crews trusting instruments that had stopped telling the truth. On the worst-maintained machines, gauges were broken and never replaced. Feed pumps failed and were signed off as working, and the men were left to guess at the one number that stood between routine and catastrophe. When the guess was wrong, there was rarely a second chance to correct it. Then there was the device meant to be the last line of defense, the one component whose entire job was to save the crew's lives: the safety valve. When boiler pressure climbed too high, the valve was supposed to lift on its own and vent steam to the sky, bleeding off the excess before it could reach the breaking point. It hissed and roared when it opened, and to a crew trying to work or think or simply rest, that roar was a constant, grating nuisance. So men defeated it. They weighted it down. They screwed the adjustment tight. In the earliest days, some tied it shut or held it closed by hand, annoyed at the noise, not grasping that the noise was the sound of their own survival. The very first American-built locomotive to enter regular service was destroyed this way, its boiler bursting after a crewman silenced the hissing valve, killing the man responsible and scalding the driver beside him. It happened again and again across the following century, sometimes through impatience, sometimes when inexperienced replacement workers, brought in during strikes, over-tightened a valve they did not understand. The safeguard only worked if nobody touched it, and somebody always eventually did. Not every locomotive killed with a bang, though. Some did it in total silence, and those were arguably the cruelest of all. Steam engines breathe out more than smoke. Incomplete combustion, especially from poor coal or a badly drafted fire, produces carbon monoxide, a gas with no color, no smell, and no warning. In the open air, it blows away harmlessly. Seal that exhaust into a confined space, and it becomes a patient, invisible killer. The danger was worst in exactly the places where a heavily loaded engine was working hardest and moving slowest. the long tunnels and snow sheds cut through mountains where the exhaust had nowhere to escape and simply pooled around the cab. The physics of it were quietly vicious. Carbon monoxide is a cumulative poison, so the longer a crew was exposed, the deeper the danger grew. Run through a tunnel at speed, and you drew fresh air in behind you and were out the far end before the gas could do its work. Stall inside that tunnel, wheels slipping on wet rail, and the exposure climbed with every passing minute while the men breathed it in without the faintest clue anything was wrong. Crews on some mountain lines reported blurred vision, pounding headaches, and near blackouts as they fought their engines through the dark bores. In one river tunnel, Camelback engines with the cab perched in the middle of the boiler poisoned their own crews so badly that men died at the controls, and the ventilation meant to protect them had been stripped out because it made the foul air worse instead of better. On a mountain line in the Alps in the 1920s, a stalled train left 7 railwaymen dead of gas poisoning in a single tunnel. And the worst of it, the deadliest railway disaster of its kind, came on a wartime night in southern Italy in 1944. A heavily overloaded freight train, packed far beyond capacity, stalled deep inside a long tunnel on a steep grade, its 2 locomotives burning low-grade coal that produced far more poison than heat. The wheels slipped. The train stopped. The crews were the closest to the source, and they were the first to fall, one driver losing consciousness while reaching for the reverse gear that might have backed everyone out to safety. The engines idled on for half an hour after the men who ran them had already collapsed, pumping gas back through the cars. Most of the several hundred who died never woke up. Survivors described the dead sitting as though asleep. The crews had no chance at all. They were poisoned before they understood there was anything to fear. If the physics behind these machines is pulling you in, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the engineering and the human stories behind the railroads every week, and there is a great deal more where this came from. There was one more way the machine could kill its crew, and it had nothing to do with heat or pressure or gas. It was simply where the men sat. In the push for speed and clear forward vision, some designs placed the crew right at the front of the locomotive, with nothing ahead of them but a thin sheet of the cab wall and the track. It gave a magnificent view. It also meant that in any serious collision, the men were the crumple zone. When one such fast electric locomotive struck an obstruction at a grade crossing, the crew took the full force of the impact with no structure between them and whatever they hit. The lesson was written in the redesign that followed, which pulled the cab back and wrapped it in a protective nose, but that improvement came only after the earlier layout had already proven what it cost. So if these dangers were understood, if crews knew the crown sheet could drop and the gas could pool and the boiler could burst, why did it keep happening for well over 100 years? Part of the answer is that knowledge lived in people, not in manuals, and people wore out. A veteran engineer could read a boiler by feel, sense a fire going wrong by its color, catch a failing water level before a gauge admitted it. But that expertise took decades to build and vanished the moment a man retired, was called up to war, or was replaced on short notice by someone who had never been properly trained. When wartime pressure or a labor shortage or plain corner cutting put inexperienced hands in the cab, the machine did not lower its standards to match. It demanded the same constant vigilance it always had, and punished its absence exactly the same way. Part of the answer is economics. Maintaining a boiler to a truly safe standard cost money and took the engine out of service. A clogged gauge, a weeping valve, a feed pump that mostly worked were easy to defer, easy to sign off, easy to send back out for one more run. And the machines were forgiving right up until the instant they were not. That gap between 100 safe trips and the one that killed was exactly what lulled everyone into treating the danger as someone else's problem. And part of the answer is simply that the men accepted it. They understood the bargain of the job. They stood next to the fire and the pressure every working day because that was the work, and the same power that could destroy them was the power that moved a nation's freight and paid their wages. They trusted the machine because they had no other choice, and now and then the machine broke that trust in the most violent way imaginable. What finally ended the killing was not better boilers or stricter rules, though both helped. It was a different machine entirely. When diesel locomotives arrived, they swept the old dangers away almost as a side effect. There was no vast reservoir of superheated water waiting to flash into steam, no crown sheet to uncover, no safety valve to tie down, no boiler to launch off the frame. A crew started a diesel with the turn of a key instead of hours of tending fire and water. The machine still had its hazards, but the specific intimate terror of standing beside a pressure vessel that might erupt without warning was gone. The men in the cab could finally turn their backs on the engine and not wonder if it would be the last thing they ever did. That is the quiet irony at the center of the whole story. The steam locomotive was one of the most magnificent machines humanity ever built, a roaring, living thing that reshaped continents and compressed distance and time. But its power came from holding an explosion in check, hour after hour, and the people who held it in check paid the price whenever the balance slipped. Every crown sheet that dropped, every valve that was screwed down, every tunnel that filled with silent gas was the same story told again. The machine and the men who commanded it were never more than a few feet and a few seconds apart. So the next time you see a steam locomotive preserved behind a rope at a museum, gleaming and harmless in the afternoon light, look past the polished brass and the fresh paint. Look at the cramped cab and the backhead crowded with gauges, and picture the two men who once stood there in the dark, reading a glass tube by lantern light, keeping the water above the fire. They knew what the beautiful machine could do. They ran it anyway. And more often than the railroads ever liked to admit, it was the last thing they did.